Hi, Mage fans. This is your host, Terry Robinson with Mage the Podcast, and my guest today is Yui. They are a practitioner and enthusiast and, dare I say, expert about chaos magic, and we are going to do a paradigm deep dive on that. Yui, how you doing?
I'm doing pretty well, Terry. Expert is a very strong word, but you know what? I'm just going to go with it.
Yeah,
We're going to roll with it.
That it's weird when something is part of someone's like personal practice to be like enthusiast. Like I guess I could theoretically be a math enthusiast, but
Yeah, but but like you're like a mage expert, right? Like, is anyone going to dispute that at this point? Is anyone going to call you out for like,
So I'll tell you something. I had a moment of shame because for a text that is unreleased yet, I decided to be a little bit funny and introduce a bit of lore about the origin of a particular group. And then 6 months later, I was reading something and they're like, by the way, canonically, this group comes from this thing. And I'm like, what? Where the heck? How did that? So now during the public comment process for that thing, I now need to submit a bit of a Reddit that's like, hi, my name's Terry Robinson. I made the podcast and I was wrong. Please edit this. And like, if it gets out into the wild, I'm going to have to track down every copy of that book and just like cross it out and correct it. So even if I'm an expert, I'm certainly still fallible, I guess is my TLDR on that story.
yeah, I'll have to do like a Stalinist, erasing from the photograph of that.
Yeah. So why don't you explain your interaction then with chaos magic or the degree of familiarity you feel you have with it?
As far as magic goes in general, I've had a passing familiarity with it for about 5 years. And with chaos magic, I've been an active practitioner for the past 3 years. And I've generally been involved in studying the paranormal and occult since I was a teenager.
Is chaos magic a practice or practice type where if you say something wrong, like strange people will arrive in the night and take you away? Or is it one of those things where it's like, we're all kind of figuring it out together?
It's a very open, I would say, egalitarian practice. It's not specifically kind of hated as far as I know outside of an individual basis. So it's not, it isn't suffering from any kind of institutional scrutiny as far as I understand it. Yeah, no, generally the most danger you're going to be in when being a chaos magic practitioner is to yourself, if anything. So you don't have to worry too much about that.
Going back one, how did you first learn about Mage the Ascension?
I learned about Mage the Ascension from some image boards that were mainly concerned with just general tabletop role-playing. And I had wanted to, I had just kind of, I don't want to say graduated from Dungeons & Dragons, but I had graduated from Dungeons & Dragons and I was just totally burnt out on it. And I said to myself, I'm going to find a role-playing game that's not this. And just, I was looking for something more narratively focused and interested in kind of actually setting up a world. Because with something like D&D, you have a general like world presuppositions with like medieval kind of ideas and things like this. But if you're not running a setting like Eberron or, Forgotten Realms, you're kind of out of luck. I wanted something whereas like, I don't want it to be medieval. I don't want it to be this and that. And I want to just basically move away from that whole dungeon crawl kind of paradigm that was stuck with running for the past couple of years. So I looked up alternatives and Mage was my introduction to World of Darkness in general, because I saw people posting about how this is the craziest game you'll ever play. And it's, it's only run by, people who are philosophy majors and all this stuff. And I said, well, I have been studying philosophy like, since I was 10 years old and I had like a Nietzsche book. So it's like, okay, this seems kind of, it's on my alley. I'll see what this is about. I didn't start with M20 because for my pocket, it was too expensive at the time. So I just bought a secondhand copy of second edition and read it cover to cover. And I was like, this is incredible. I don't know if I can run this or if I know anyone who could suffer through me running this or if people even play this anymore. Because I was stuck with just kind of services like Roll20 where you weren't able to choose who was going to be a player or not. So until I kind of ran it with my friends personally, it was my white whale. I was always concerned with, well, if I were to run my, my great masterpiece game, it would be this. And that was that for a number of years until COVID hit. And suddenly all my friends mostly decided, hey, what's great? role-playing games, we can do that together and, kind of avoid the current circumstance that we're in right now in some manner. And I said, well, you know what? If you all are, willing and available, there's this game about wizards and, men in black and stuff. And they said, well, I don't know, but okay. And then that's how I kind of got my foot in on the practical sense.
I feel like there should be an edition of Mage that's like really small and says Mage, it's a game about wizards, and just kind of like leaves it there, because that's essentially the pitch for Invisible Sun, which to me could be surprisingly seductive. I found it interesting, like my own storyteller style over time has become like less and less philosophical, and I don't know what that means, because like as my games go, that epistemological question tends to get downplayed for me. I wonder if there's like a relationship between people who have high comfort with the system versus like high comfort with the setting conceit. And as you get more comfortable with one, you tend to talk about the other one less. I have no idea if that's the case, but that's the weird theory I'm just going to kind of throw out into the universe. So you ran this game. How did you find running Mage? Like, was it something that you found enjoyable? Did the players pick up on it?
My players were all like really new to World of Darkness in general, so having to really introduce all the ideas of just the basic metaphysics of the world through Mage was really interesting, because as far as I knew in terms of what I was able to experience via actual plays, it was all vampire, right? And I like vampire, but it's not like my specific kind of flavor of World of Darkness that I prefer. And I had all this stuff in my mind about, oh, but it's gothic and everyone's mean and no one likes each other and everyone's trying to kill each other and there's all this high tragedy. And when I ran Mage, I kind of went into it with the idea that, okay, well, but this is a game about, in M20 it's stated multiple times, this is a game about hope and change and all this stuff. And personally, when I run games, I try to pare back on violence, and not for the sake of like censorship or anything, but because I feel that if there is something like violence or gratuity or meanness or, kind of conflict, that it should be really pivotal in terms of how the story is constructed. Mm-hmm. And it shouldn't be forced on players. So when I started the game, I didn't go in with any, this is, who you're going to be fighting and this is that. I told players, you can be anything you want. You can be any of the factions, and we're just going to roll with, whatever you desire to play. And so what I ended up with was a group full of disparates and traditionalists, and the game was like a snowball. And it eventually picked up, speed as it rolled downhill. And the majority of the antagonists that I threw at them, that I intended to be antagonists, they ended up just being their friends because the players were nice to them. At the end of it, everyone who they thought that was their friend in the beginning ended up, betraying them in some way or another. And they ended up at the end of that first chronicle kind of in this mixed position where they had to mostly rebuild their own, personal sense of what a tradition is, what a paradigm is, who I am in relation to all this stuff. They had to rebuild that from the ground floor. So they had a good time. And I felt I was pretty successful at introducing certain ideas about the world. And honestly, it was nice to be able to articulate something that wasn't doom and gloom. This was a game where the majority of it wasn't people getting killed or, murder or anything, or a lot of it was about empathy and about like talking to people with different ideas other than your own and seeking to understand the world instead of just like judging it harshly. Very much with Mage, I felt that I was able to express something in the game that you can read it in a book, right? But it's different when you actually run it. And it was interesting to see that kind of be realized.
Would you say that the real Ascension were the friends we made along the way?
Absolutely. No, you say that in the podcast multiple times. I absolutely believe it. I think that Mage is a game about friendship in a lot of ways. The traditions, there's a lot of interpersonal kind of bickering, but at the end of the day, they're all more or less friends. And the Technocratic Union itself, again, there's all these like, oh, well, the Syndicate is like the NWO, and the NWO doesn't like the Progenitors and all this stuff. And that's great. And that's something you can use in the books. But they're also like people who respect each other, and they also, share a lot of stuff in common. And that's why they're an organization, right? And, I think it's a great game to kind of talk about like, people who are, absolutely different from each other, but who still are able to cooperate. The Verbena and the Chorister, completely on opposite ends of the spectrum, but they're also like, but at the end of the day, like we're still fighting the same fight. And no other World of Darkness game really has that sense of like blatant optimism. And I just really enjoy that.
It's kind of interesting because one of the knobs is You can set how dark the world is by the relationship between the power of the protagonist and the power of the antagonist. And one of the ways to adjust the power of the protagonist groups is how well do they get along together. Like, if the threats of the world of darkness are not huge, like it's not one of those things like in Exile, it's like any moment the fair folk could invade from the wild, or the Death Lords will rise up, or something like that, or the Yozis are going to return. You can have dysfunctional groups and you can still accomplish something great by just increasing the level of cooperation in the game a little bit. And I like that as a knob to adjust in the game. Like, my personal preference, I think, is powerful traditions that are poorly organized, as in they have a lot of resources internally, but it's hard to get them all to move at the same time just because they're so spread out. And I have the trope of the real ascension of the friends we made along the way. And I don't know at what point I picked that up in the same way that I just kind of refer to things as the Widowmaker. But I agree with you. Mage has this element of hope that a lot of the other games kind of fail to capture. The way I generally played at the table is the groups are always slightly less cooperative than you'd like them to be for whatever given task that you need to accomplish. So you had this mixed game. When you were running this for the first time, was there any bit of it that you're like, this is a little bit harder than I wish it were, or anything where you were surprised at how straightforward it was?
I was worried that the politics would be confusing to new players, where Mage is really the only World of Darkness game that actually kind of reflects a somewhat global perspective. And that comes with a lot of complications and a lot of geopolitical assumptions that you just have to figure out when you're running it. So, you have to say, okay, well, how does this actually work in practice? And you get to decide that at your table, right? The book doesn't tell you how to do that. So you very much, have to understand your players in order to understand what that ideal tone should look like. In regards to that, I was worried that this was going to be confusing, that people would say, well, why does this person like this person, but then they have this enmity with this other faction? And really, that wasn't a problem at all, because everyone kind of was able to embody the stereotype more or less of their tradition and then branch out from there. The main struggle that I had and that I still face with the second chronicle that I just finished is, in general, I find it hard to engage with players in terms of the magic system. Mm-hmm. It might just be my style of GMing, but my players tend to shy away from just going all out with magic all the time. And maybe that's in terms of maybe paradox is a scary thing that they want to avoid. But in general, they more or less kind of steer clear of, doing these super crazy vulgar effects and really want to keep things really low key and rather, solve things via, just straight up diplomacy or, maneuvering around their enemies rather than confronting them, which is, I would say an interesting way of approaching the game, right? A mage, especially in the kind of first edition, second edition era, was very much kick down the door, matrix, two guns blazing. That's awesome, right? I love that. But in reality, mages are very squishy. So I actually do think it's interesting that could approach it where it's these guys, if you have a society, a shadow society of people, conflicting factions, mm-hmm. who are all extremely powerful to various degrees. I mean, even a starting mage is really powerful. They're not going to be constantly trying to kill each other, because why would you? Because you're essentially fighting people with various grades of nuclear weapons, right? Mm-hmm. There's no point to fighting because you're just going to destroy each other more or less. And I think that actually makes sense within how the setting works, is that the verbena doesn't fight in terms of really, I'm going to, have this huge plant that, is animated to life and bites off your head. The verbena is going to say, hey, look at these mythic threads. How can I manipulate this and undermine your entire ideological edifice?
It's one of those things where, how do we run a game where a single gunshot can realistically kill a player? And also, if a single gunshot can't kill someone, that is also a different game to me. And
well, that's Vampire.
Yeah. One of the things that Knights Black Agents does that I think is kind of interesting is when they are running a one-shot or when you are running an unrunning game, to establish how badass you are and how cool the stuff you can do. Any of the points you spend in your first scene, just you automatically get back. So one of the contrivances of the setting is that you're kind of it's kind of like Jason Bourne with vampires. In like a Bond movie, you will have a first scene that tries to establish how cool James Bond is as a character by like parachuting onto a ski lift to get a flamethrower to take down a helicopter using a jetpack or something like that. And similarly, the games will build something like that, where there's this cool opening scene to show how competent everyone is. And any resources you spend in that opening scene, you automatically get back because they're just trying to establish what you can do. I am wondering if there's a way to bring that to Mage.
That's not a really bad idea at all. Kind of using that exploratory space in the beginning prologue as a kind of bar that the rest of the game is measured against, like that is maybe the height of, what powers get expressed. Then everything else is like, well, we don't need to do that all the time. So let's, let's, instead of, drinking straight from the fire hose, let's, turn on the sprinkler.
And it also lets you establish very quickly, like an antagonist, if that scene takes place busting down the door of the progenitor facility as you find the doctor in charge of things and say, where are the Kelsian rubies or something like that. It also gets the plot moving real fast compared to, so one of your Chantry mates has a letter to you from Duizatep. But that's...
Oh my god, that's literally how my game started with all my players getting emails from various groups.
I am not saying in any way it is a bad way to do it, because it's one of those things, especially if you're doing it for the first time, where everyone's like, okay, what are we doing? At this point, the preponderance of my Mage experience is now running one-shots. Over the course of COVID, I think I've run 18 to 20. So...
Holy wow.
Yeah. I'm pretty pleased that I've produced something. I've let roughly 100 people try Mage.
You're the preacher on the pulpit. You're just
trying to be.
You have the 700-page book, and you say this is the word.
That's the thing. I cheat. I don't preach out of the 700-page book. I preach out of the quick start, which I think is remarkably good. Any general Mage thoughts before we talk more specifically about Chaos Magic?
Generally, in regards to Mage, it's just my favorite game, and I think it's probably, I hesitate to use words like deep, but generally I find it an incredibly powerful reservoir of various ideas and influences, and it very much bears the mark of a storied creative history with a lot of really insightful and interesting people working on it. And no matter what edition is being used, I really always find something valuable every single one of the books, where it's obvious that so many different perspectives, you tend to really just kind of get a broad strokes version, especially of the World of Darkness, that really kind of gives you the biggest sandbox possible to maneuver around in. And I think for a lot of games, they don't really give you that. When you play a setting book for another game, or just otherwise something that's a bit more rules light, you don't always get a whole lot. Whereas, World of Darkness and especially Mage feel like whatever you want to run, you can do it. And I think that's really empowering to a lot of GMs and players.
Our notional topic today is Chaos Magic. What is Chaos Magic, Yui, and where did it come from?
Chaos Magic is a very recent branch of Western occultism, esotericism, that more or less emerged in the 1970s in the English occult circles. We're talking a occult scene that's predominantly influenced at the time in the 60s and 70s by the recent resurgence of, things like Wicca, and definitely a post-Aleister Crowley kind of paradigm of ceremonial magic.
Is there a single person that was kind of responsible for bringing it into existence, or that cataloged the practices? Like, is there a key figure or several key figures with its early practice?
The road to the generalization of chaos magic is a long one, but in general, a lot of it can be traced back to an early 20th century artist named Austin Osman Spare, who, while not explicitly a magician in his own life, at least as far as we understand it, very much took kind of the ideas of his contemporaries like Aleister Crowley and said, this is all great, but Crowley being a real-life hermetic, much like the ones in Mage, Austin Osman Spare took a look at it and said, can we get rid of various implements and instruments and rituals and da-da-da? And it's like, well, what's the common metric of all these? Can we simplify it a bit? What does it actually look like if you took some of these ideas and just generalize that practice? How can we get to the basic roots of how magic actually works? And he died sometime in the 1950s. His ideas were kind of correlated and expanded upon by a man, an English occultist, Peter J. Carroll, who wrote Liber Null and then a book called Psychonaut, which mostly are credited with the creation of what we call modern chaos magic. I don't want to say he invented it, but he very much was the guy who said, all right, this is it. This is all here together. And this is kind of a unified idea of what this can look like.
Oh, interesting. Because I know Osmond Spare as a symbolist painter that is kind of associated with the occult movement. I didn't know that there's more to it than that. So is this a particularly Western practice? Does it have other cultural antecedents? Or alternatively, is it heavily influenced by anything else? Or is it, from what you described, it is almost the opposite, is an attempt to remove elements from magic rather than add? Does this kind of simplification move, do you know of any precedent for it?
In general, the Western esoteric tradition tends towards simplifying over time rather than adding on complexity. Aleister Crowley himself, wanted to, kind of simplify and clarify certain aspects of real life hermeticism. And, he succeeded in doing that, but, from a chaos magic perspective, people thought that, he didn't go far enough and that we could go further. Essentially, the basic intellectual heritage of it comes from a mostly Western esoteric, hermetic, I would say, somewhat theosophic, but also just, general, also, a bit of Wicca in there. It is very Western, but it's also really free to incorporate a lot of practices of Eastern magic. And that's a thing that I think a lot of the practitioners of chaos magic really are into, is kind of taking this absolute kind of egalitarian point of view and saying, okay, well, we've kind of broken down the basics of, Western magic, and a lot of this applies to Eastern as well. And how can we understand both of these on the same level rather than, doing something that a lot of, the old school hermetics would want to do and say, well, no, this is a different thing and this is separate and blah, blah, blah. And chaos magic is like, no, let's mix and match.
So what would then be the keys to the chaos magic paradigm? So to me, when we talk about paradigm, we are essentially saying the foundational beliefs that indicate that magic is possible. For instance, to someone who is a religious practitioner, their paradigm tenets would be something like, there is a higher power. It responds to human requests. And that is the font from which mages are allowed to do magic. Or alternatively, someone could say, there are more laws of physics than we know, and the enlightened practitioner has access to them and can do wondrous things because of that. What are kind of those foundational beliefs within chaos magic?
Chaos magic is interesting in as much as it's almost a meta paradigm that can be stacked on top of other paradigms for, this kind of broader perspective. So there's no reason why what you just described can also, not be something that a chaos magic practitioner can work with. It's just that the chaos magic practitioner takes it almost a step removed and says, so for the, the mage, right, in terms of Mage of the Ascension, who says, okay, my magic comes from this divine source, the chaos magic practitioner will say, that's what I'm choosing to believe right now and to kind of practice with that belief for this particular spell or working or, sigil or whatever it is. But that is not necessarily what I believe all the time. Chaos magic as this kind of meta paradigm really falls into the kind of behavioral pattern of using a particular tool for a particular job and trying to experiment with what exactly is the best for that. So, for example, the verbena works with, say, the seasonal patterns, right? And say a chaos magic practitioner, okay, well, I want to manipulate the weather. From what they can understand, right? They would take a look at a lot of different beliefs and say, well, a lot of these verbena, kind of high ritual nature workings based on seasons and cycles of nature, that's obviously tied to weather patterns, right? So if I want to call in a thunderstorm, this seems like a fairly reliable way to do it. And if I see additional things that I can kind of take into that and improve upon it, I can kind of use that and make this custom ritual and working in order to basically affect that. But then the next day it's well, I don't really want to call it thunderstorm anymore. But that doesn't mean that I'm a member of the verbena or that I follow their particular set of paradigms. It's that I utilize that for one particular working and then believe that to kind of, be an open and shut case. And then I move on to whatever, kind of desire or, working that I wish to accomplish the next day.
It sounds like chaos magic is kind of this earnest form of postmodernism where it is saying that there is no absolute truth. All tools are capable Does chaos magic put the power in the tools or the practitioner? I'm having trouble with that. Like, so for instance, if a tool is merely a focus in my paradigm to give me access to divine power, it sounds like a chaos magic practitioner is fixating on the tools and not necessarily the principles used to operate them.
This is an interesting debate that actually happens within the chaos magic community in itself as to whether, is it the specific tools, is it the practice itself, right? Is it the ritual, or is it the belief? I think a lot of mages in universe would also have that debate. And it depends on how you want to go about it exactly, right? Either way more or less gets you to the same perspective, but it can cause variances in how exactly your magic works, I suppose. Where if you place a primacy on belief, then you're going to be very much invested in a number of intellectual traditions, right? You're going to have a enormous library because you're going to be trying to grasp the basic similarities between all these various paradigms and try to understand, okay, where does this lean into? What are the advantages of this? What are the fundamental assumptions of this? What political structure formulated this idea? That kind of comes from the hermetic intellectual tradition that chaos magic descends from, where it's very, again, very literally just studious, whereas the kind of more practical kind of freewheeling approach is not so much interested in, oh well, I don't need to know why this exactly works, I need to know the process, right? And I think a lot of hollow ones in universe really kind of apply this principle where they're very much like, what is the basics of what this means? Okay, well, I can take that. If this sigil means this thing, does it matter if I draw it with a piece of chalk or lipstick on a napkin or anything else? It could be a piece of charcoal, anything, a pen or a pencil. The specifics of it almost like become generalized idea, right? So it's not, say like you're trying to work with the Order of Hermes, like high ritual stuff to summon a spirit. For Hermetic, it's like you have to do it at this hour, at this time, and this day, and under this lunar cycle and blah, blah, blah. Whereas, say like a hollow one who's a chaos magic practitioner would take that from a practice perspective and say, well, what are you exactly doing? I don't necessarily need to have a specific context for it if what is being done is this and that, right? So they may take it and say, well, instead of trying to summon this angelic servitor on the full moon, let's try it on the new moon and see what happens. And they might get an entirely different result using the same practice.
Okay, so it sounds like there are two strains. One is seemingly going back to Austin Osman Spear's poetry, is kind of the idea that belief itself is a form of psychic energy and you just kind of need a way to direct it. And all magical systems are just attempts to do that, and a particular practitioner will find a set that works best for them. Another way of taking it is someone to essentially claim that humanity is the tools that it creates as a tool-using animal, and that all of these magical practices produce tools in some way, and the chaos magic practitioner is merely recognizing the potency in all of them. So it does not seem like at any point the chaos magic practitioner is being ironic. Is that the case?
Generally, no. I think there's an element of humor to a lot of chaos magic practice, but I don't think it really ever veers into irony because I think there's a humorous seriousness that is involved in it. With what you just described, it's very much with what you just described. I think chaos magic oscillates between this almost platonistic worldview where there is kind of this ideal intention and that you're kind of trying to work out that intention, and that's that intention has the primacy of the ritual itself, and then it oscillates between that Platonism and then a kind of like a quasi phenomenological Heideggerian approach where you say, okay, humans are tool using creatures who reenact things and ideas in their environment in various ways. That interaction is the important part, right? So it's kind of an internal versus external worldview, and both are equally valid.
So let's walk through some examples if we can then. And I guess another constraint is from the gameplay perspective, we don't want this to become strictly better than all other paradigms. Like one of the problems that Mage could theoretically run into is the min-maxer paradigm of I'm awesome at everything all the time. Mage the Awakening has an interesting way of dealing with this, with the cosmological repercussions of the power of shadow names and so on. What do you see a chaos magic practitioner spending their study time doing? What do you think that downtime and preparation looks like?
I think in general, again, it either goes into this like kind of almost hyper intellectual idea of, assembling this broad base of knowledge that you can then use to apply different belief systems to specific tasks and goals. On the other hand, it almost becomes the inverse where the belief is kind of abstracted and you almost have this huge assemblage of tools that you need to utilize. And within Mage, that causes this interesting bifurcation where chaos magic practitioners, and I see what you mean by saying like we don't want them, like ideally you wouldn't want something like this to be overpowered, because it doesn't seem kind of like, oh, I can have all the benefits of these things and any of the drawbacks, right? But in a lot of ways, chaos magic is kind of almost a jack of all trades practice, where you can utilize all these various things, but you don't necessarily gain the benefits of like a full systemic dive in. Using kind of elements of something like Kabbalah or like specific brands of meditation, you can say use the practices of things associated with that, but you might not necessarily understand why it does what it does, right? Why there's this justification behind it. Or you could say, okay, well, I know like why this works, but I don't have like really the application of what like the specific focuses are. So generally, I would say chaos magic practitioners within the Mage universe, you wouldn't really have personalized or unique tools because it just doesn't make sense to have them. Because you're constantly swapping these things in and out to try to experiment and take this broad perspective. So really, you're not going to gain the benefits of having this is the hermetic chalice that gives me a negative to difficulty or something like that helps me kind of do this specific thing better, right? You're very much taking what you can and just working with it, often on the fly. I would say, if anything, the major benefit of chaos magic is that it rewards improvisation, but not necessarily rigorous magic practice, right? Is that you can be very powerful and very, widespread with what you do with chaos magic.
So one of the things that I think is interesting about what you were saying regarding that study process is, I don't know about you, but when I am learning how to do a new thing, there's that first like 20 hours where I'm figuring out just literally what is it. And then the knowledge acquisition rate increases, and then I hit some sort of plateau, and then there's a breakthrough, and then there's slow crawling towards expertise. So it sounds like chaos magic is the process of constantly being that beginner. So while you may have access to a lot of tools, it's one of those things where like you're at 30% competence with a lot of things. And that seems like it could be a real time-consuming and frustrating place to be. And that to me is kind of the moderating factor. Yes, you have 15 focuses that you can use, but each of those focuses required 80 hours of basic research, and like there goes a year of magical practice. So that way, like in game time, you're not just the avatar of awesome all the time. Is that kind of a reasonable interpretation?
Yeah, I definitely would say so. The difference between someone who spent their entire life really honing this edge of a blade and then someone who went on the internet and bought a whole bunch of different kinds of swords. And, some of those swords may be kind of fake imitations. Some of them may be actually, good and interesting and, useful. The thing is, the chaos magic practitioner just doesn't know that until like a fairly large time investment, I would say. Like you don't have like the basic paradigm of, say, someone in the Akashiana who's like, okay, well, I know, what this leads into and this, and I have the specific, body technique for that. The chaos magic practitioner, if you're a hollow one, you're just going to be getting on the ground floor saying, well, I know this works and I know that works, and I kind of need to just work it out from there. And it's very much kind of like starting very much with the basics. And bad part about taking such a broad perspective is that while it leaves you free of a lot of biases and assumptions can kind of help you understand various things. And in the mage world, when a hermetic has an assumption that they can toss a fireball at your face, they can probably do that. Whereas, if you're a hollow one, you're like, well, maybe I could do that. I don't know. I haven't tried it.
It is interesting paradigmatically in that there is nothing that the paradigm explicitly rules out, but at the same time, it seems like there is nothing that the paradigm particularly excels at in terms of magics that it produces. It is trading depth for breadth, and I could see a chaos magic character getting into some real difficulties at some higher levels being able to find materials and so on. So, for instance, it may be relatively easier to find introductory text on just about any group because that's something they make public or that you can get from friends or whatever within the magical community. But when you're trying to become the imponderable Neometer of Justice who has the ability to use Prime 5 to open up a node, unless you're an established member of that practice, there's just no way to get that material. And this isn't something that we necessarily need to produce mechanics for within the mage setting, but it is useful information to say, no, this is not overbalanced. This is not going to be something that is going to wreck your game. Is that a reasonable parsing of things?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I think, and actually a great example of this, if you want to understand the basics of how chaos magic actually looks within the world of mage and not just have to like read a bunch of real life books about how it works, check out Penny Dreadful web novel that was published, I think, in like 2004. It's on Drive Through RPG. And in that kind of novel, Penny Dreadful like does utilize like chaos magic as her paradigm, more or less. I don't think it's ever explicitly stated, but that's it's pretty much what she does. And in that, she's great at reacting to kind of like stressful, like completely improvisational scenarios. But when it comes to like kind of sitting down and actually working out the basics of something, she has to start from square one and say, well, I don't have the wealth and resources of someone in the union. I don't have this kind of social background in academia. I have some blood, a glass of milk, an angry cat, some, chewing gum, and I just have to work with that. It's very difficult for her because she is constantly being roped into these scenarios by people who have this depth of knowledge that she doesn't have. It's also that thing where in a pinch, she very much can kind of exploit that sense of hubris for her own ends and just kind of say, well, you may have all these assumptions, but I don't have those. So I can basically operate in this kind of broader spectrum that you can't. I mean, it's a very funny series of like, web serials that's compiled in a book. But otherwise, like if you want to see how does this look in Mage, it's literally there. It's the best version you could get.
Is there a set of practices that chaos magic practitioners tend to borrow from and those that they tend not to? Like, for instance, I have not seen examples of chaos magicians who are borrowing, for instance, from Sufi mysticism or Theravada Buddhism or what have you. Is there a set of practices that they tend to borrow from and those that they tend not to? Not necessarily in absolute terms, but just kind of a general preferred set of practices to look at.
I would say a lot of like what you would see is just based on the fact that chaos magic, especially in like the Western context, is a very, very young branch of occultism. Mm-hmm. So you're not going to see like all these books on like, exhausting every single topic like you will with, say Hermeticism or the various branches of Christian mysticism or, something like that. And because chaos magic is so broad, it's going to take a while for all those various nooks and crannies to be explored. I don't see why someone who's a practitioner like that couldn't use something like Sufi mysticism to really break it down and kind of see what the practices and beliefs of that operate on a more broad level. I would say as of like right now in 2021, chaos magic is very associated again with post like Aleister Crowley like high ritual magic and a lot of branches of like modern paganism. It's still in that Western sphere for the most part. But I don't see any reason in the future or in your table that you couldn't, swipe from something. You just basically have to, again, start at the ground floor and say, well, I kind of have to do the work a little bit here, which is, from a player perspective, a little bit daunting. Mm-hmm. But if you set your mind to it, I don't see like what could really stop you from it. You just have to basically say, has this been done before? And if it has, then great. If it hasn't, then you're basically almost inventing your own little mini tradition in terms of like how you're going to use this for a rote.
So it sounds like the answer to the question is no, there is not anything that is explicitly ruled out. There are the things that are at hand that were comparatively easier to get that are part of the Western tradition, but there's nothing to say that in 20 or 30 years' time we won't see chaos magicians pulling in the power of tiki or trying to figure out how to incorporate song lines into their practice. Your mileage may vary at your table, and I myself would be very uncomfortable with having a character so directly pulling on that. And to me, one of the great questions in Mage is how do we deal with the fact that like Hermeticism is largely the process of beating up other traditions and like stealing their lunch money. So there's nothing explicitly banned. Be sensitive about it. That gives your characters also an excuse seemingly to explore.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. And that's something I wanted to address is the kind of issue of appropriation. And with chaos magic, I think we can very easily run into that, oh, I'm just going to take your cultural practices and all these beliefs, and I'm going to, it could be seen as like a mangling or like a perversion of, what that is. And that's totally legitimate. I would say, from my own personal perspective, what you want to do at your table ideally is take a serious, look at those things and treat them as if they aren't represented by like a craft or another various group within the setting already, treat them as if they were part of that craft with that same level of, okay, what if there was a bunch of people who, if they saw me misusing this stuff, could come and, and beat me up really harshly for, my uses and abuses of their culture and their people. And because that will, if a GM's playing their cards right, that could definitely happen to a unwary hollow one who's just going to look up something on the internet and say, oh, well, this is neat, yoink, and just not have the context for what that is. Do your research and probably ideally just understand like the basics and don't make assumptions about things. Definitely kind of seek out like what people in various communities like that of people who are marginalized would say about it. Mm-hmm. And just kind of like do the basic work. And with a chaos magic practitioner, they're not necessarily going to like be saying a whole lot of things with their magic based on like assumptions and stuff. It's off, well, I want to instantaneously make this cup of coffee hot. That's not going to like run into a whole bunch of trouble. What you ideally want to do is just take that principle and extrapolate it to kind of more thorny issues and say, hey, listen, my character, worships a Hawaiian volcano goddess. My character goes to at lengths to say, hey, this is just something that, maybe your character like grew up there, but was not a part of that culture, or your character is like has an admiration for it. And whenever that comes up in game, you just want to, be totally honest and say, hey, this is what it is. And I'm doing it because it makes sense to me. And I have this interest in it. And I'm always willing to learn. And that's the big thing about chaos magic, is that you should always be in a place to learn as this practitioner, especially in game. You should never have that hermetic hubris of, oh, we got it. We figured it out. We've assembled all the knowledge together. Chaos magic practitioner is like, no, I don't. I know some things. I don't know everything. I got to fill in my gaps. Like you always want to be open to this further kind of knowledge gathering.
So there is an element of humility baked into it that may not be baked into other practices that look at yet more practices and say, hey, an Akashic looking at a chorister chant may say, you're not actually invoking an angel. You're actually just doing a series of breathing exercises that are tied to the cadence of that song that allow you to channel your internal energy. There's nothing external coming from this. Or a Society of Ether member who looks at a verbena's sacred herbs and go, oh no, this is just 2,4-deoxymethylpropylene. I can synthesize this in the lab. I don't need this. It is well established in Mage that there are groups that are constantly looking at what other groups are doing and saying, oh no, you're not actually doing the thing you're doing. You're just doing this thing. And it seems like with that context, a chaos magician may actually bring more respect to the party than other groups that may be doing that. So that's kind of good to hear. There are a set of practices in chaos magic that to me kind of scream chaos magic, like the idea of sigils and synchronization and egregores and so on. Would you like to talk about that, or would you like to talk about rotes first?
I think they're kind of
tied together, yeah.
Implied. Yeah, I think the thing with the rotes is that for the practitioner, the rotes are always going to be very personal.
Okay.
They're very much going to be cobbled together from probably a number of sources. And with those sources, those are going to influence the instruments they use. But generally, I would say kind of the basics that a lot of chaos practitioners really just gravitate towards on average are, again, the use of sigils, various writing implements, often forms of art, like painting or, music, just kind of that kind of expression, body work where it's, kind of getting into trances or, ecstatic states of dance, visualization, almost with like an internal component of, okay, well, I want to use this rote to instantaneously bring my cat from my house to in front of me on the subway for whatever reason. It's almost like you have to get that portrait of a cat inside your head and then, project it outwards. That's often like a very like real life common chaos magic practice. And egregores, most definitely. And I would almost argue very similar to dream speakers and verbena. I would say chaos magic practitioners are very open to spirits, more or less. I would say that it's a very broad perspective on that. So going back to like what we were talking about with appropriation, a chaos magic user is never going to kind of scoff at various spirits and say, oh, well, you're just like this and that, it's very much like, okay, well, this is from this culture, this is from that culture. They're all existing in and out of here, and you just have to work with them. And because you have that broad perspective, you're just going to look at, the entirety of the Umbral courts and say, oh yeah, all that's real, all that's valid. It's a lot.
When you say sigil, that is a location in Planescape, my favorite Dungeons and Dragons setting. It is also just kind of a glyph. What does sigil mean in Chaos Magic? Because I think it has like a broader notion than it might when we just say the word. So what is a sigil?
A sigil in Chaos Magic is basically just symbol, or almost just a linguistic symbolic expression of an idea or a notion or an expression or something that exists, right? So you can have sigils for rocks, for lightning, for significant other. You can have sigils that represent various gods and deities or specific ideas, right? So if you invoke the sigil of compassion when dealing with someone, who maybe is uninclined to necessarily act friendly towards you, that can very much put that in your advantage, where it's, okay, well, I put this sticky note on my laptop of compassion sigil that I've created. That's kind of an amalgamation of the letters of compassion put into this one symbol. And as long as I kind of like carry that around in my person, when I go to talk to this aggressive individual, that might help them, if they see it, put them at ease and say, oh, you know what, maybe I was wrong. Maybe we can talk this out.
And sigil here it seems like something that can become very exacting. That it seems to be this process of you formally stating your desire or intention in the world, and the process of getting a sigil that is so thoroughly an embodiment of that it can change the world or empower you to change the world seems like it could be very time consuming, in the same way that a hermetic may need to write up the 777 names of Gabriel to try and invoke the power of that angel. Likewise, a chaos magic practitioner may have to try dozens of tries to figure out the sigil that will actually instantiate the change in the world they desire. It's kind of interesting that like the notion of sigil kind of has gone in some interesting directions. I am mostly familiar with the idea of chaos magic sigils through Grant Morrison. Not that I am a huge fan of Grant's comic books, but just the discussion of them saying that, hey, this comic book series is an extended sigil of a creative idea that I would like to put out in the world. And I have a hard time not being entirely okay with a magical practice where they say, I did this magical work and the outcome of the work happened to be this comic book you're reading. And to me, that is a pretty powerful reframing of the creative act in a way that I find interesting and potent, and I think can super go into a mage game. Do you have any examples or recommendations for people who are like, so what the heck is a sigil? Where can I see some? Is that something that is considered private to the practitioner, or is that something where we can go online and find them?
You can absolutely go online and find them. And in fact, there's, many tutorials online as to how to make them. Like you said, it can be very, very complex as in terms of just creating an entire work of art that spans years of your life. But it can also be something that you do in 15 minutes on an afternoon when you need it. It just depends on the complexity of the thought, I suppose. If you want to know how to make one, pretty much who you refer to, Grant Morrison, they do a excellent job of introducing it. I don't know exactly the name of the YouTube video, but if you look up Grant Morrison sigil on YouTube, you should be able to find it. If not otherwise, then there's probably some tutorial in it. It's very basic in a good way. It's very much kind of this instrumental, like basic foundational practice, much like our prayer can, mean many different things in a holistic kind of theological practice. Sigils are kind of that for the Hermetic tradition. It's taking, okay, the sigil of a demon. Well, it's like, well, why does it mean that thing for a demon? And it's like, okay, well, if that's, for that specific thing, then why can't it be for anything else in the world, right? And like you said, it can be, again, this just incredibly nuanced and ongoing and maybe never even end in terms of your sigil craft, which is kind of, I think, ideally what archmages get up to. Mm-hmm. Is, when you're at the 10th level sphere, when you do a sigil, it's less of, I do a thing and it has a specific, concrete impact within the next 5 minutes. And it's more the next decade is going to be, this sigil being worked out in various ways. And that's how chaos magic can go from being this kind of like low level, thing associated with, very basic orphans, hollow ones, to being something that a master will utilize and, to this incredible depth, in the same way that one of the members of the Order of Hermes, if, their master, when they invoke an angel, it's going to be a hell of an angel. When, an Archmaster, uses this sigil, it's going to be the Invisibles times 10.
So it sounds like the difficulty of writing a sigil is going to roughly scale with the dot level of the effect that you're going to do. So that's always
and
good
the
to
intention,
hear.
yeah.
And I also like the idea that you answered the question of what would a chaos magic archmaster look like. It's now one of those things where if we start this roughly from sometime in the 1970s or what have you, we have had the 50 years it would take to produce the first archmasters, and I'd love to see them throwing their weight around in the umbral courts. Another concept in chaos magic that I hear a lot about are the idea of like servitors and egregores. Can you talk about what they are?
Yes, servitors and egregores are more or less kind of variations on spirit model animism. Think about like a lot of dream speaker associated paradigms, and stuff like angels and demons, and even honestly like fairies and like spirits of the land and things like that. Servitors and egregores, what makes them interesting is that they are often associated with a psychological model of chaos magic where these entities can be directly manifested from your own internal will and consciousness. And oftentimes it's seen as you taking a part of your mind and externalizing it into something kind of totally manifested. If you're familiar with the idea of a tulpa, it's very close to that, where it's necessarily your personality, but it's an idea that you've nurtured and developed that's come from you. And you're able to say, well, now this is its own discrete entity that goes around and drinks coffee and has conversations and maybe isn't my best friend anymore after a couple of weeks. And that's kind of weird and scary. Servitors are usually used for a specific purpose and then banished. They're kind of, it's almost like a tool-based approach where it says, okay, create this thing, go do it. And then once you're done, self-destruct. An egregore is more often than not just an entirely artificial sentient creature, and very much would be, in game terms involved with, the mind sphere and spirit and all that kind of stuff.
So it sounds like a servitor could be a case where we may look at something more results-based in terms of adjudicating magical effects, where, for instance, my character is doing a matter effect, say to assemble a brick wall or something like that. And instead of me using telekinesis or magically instantiating it, my character could be using matter to create a servitor to assemble those bricks. At the end of the day, I've functionally done a matter 3 or matter 4 effect, depending on how complicated it is. But within the logic of the game world, it looks like I have summoned a creature to do this assembly to get the ultimate effect that I want. So I am a fan of whenever a paradigm has the ability to dip into results-based rather than process-based, because otherwise we get into this weird space of like, oh, you're creating a creature, you need life 4, and you need prime 2 to empower the thing, and you need mind 3 to control it. And you're like, no. Guy's just making a brick wall. This is fundamentally a matter of fact. What is a tulpa? I don't have background on that.
A tulpa is generally a kind of metaphysical notion that comes out of Tibetan Buddhism. That's essentially with the process of enough mental concentration and meditation and kind of visualization goes along the same idea as an egregore or servitor, where you can just manifest this via this process. You could do it via non-means of meditation, but that's traditionally within that Eastern practice is how it's been kind of visualized, where a Buddhist monk could externalize a desire to kind of help him deal with it and kind of rationalize like why he feels that way about a certain aspect of the world, right? It's almost taking this psychological approach to, okay, well, I'm more or less just taking myself and turning it into a magical manifestation so that it almost becomes an exercise in therapy, I suppose.
It seems interesting that a lot of these practices are very much grounded in the physical world, where instead of me using mind 4 to move around the mental furniture of another person, I would literally use a mind 4 effect, which would manifest maybe one of my chantry mates' hidden desires that they are having difficulty dealing with. I give that thing physical form. We are able to talk through the problem, maybe through an extended intelligence plus empathy roll or something like that, or perception or charisma plus intimidate if necessary. And at the end of that effect, the change that I want to have affected in that person who has requested that I help them with whatever, we didn't go into a mindscape. We didn't go into the Maya. We did the opposite. We brought that metaphysical embodiment into the real world to interact with it. Is that a theme within chaos magic? It doesn't seem to have a strong sense of there being other places.
It's mostly kind of bringing the idea of other places into yourself, right? So for that, I think that's a really great way of seeing it and then utilizing it in the game, because I find that the mind sphere almost takes on to various degrees like sinister connotations of, especially with the NWO, this kind of idea of like total mind control and absolute, domination of someone's will. But within like this practice, it can be used towards positive ends where it's not so much this mind effect that I'm changing your personality, but I'm helping you understand yourself better in a way that results in that change. In effect, that chaos magic action with a servitor or a tulpa or an egregore, you're using that in a way that almost like gives more willpower to the person, maybe one of the mages in your chantry that you're using it on and helping them with. You're giving them the control of the situation rather than taking it away.
I also like the idea, though, that a lot of the embodiments of this paradigm are about not having the mage go into a mental realm, but doing the opposite, where a character who is on a umbral trip never leaves material reality. And when they have that interaction with a bunch of people in a nightclub, that is the umbral court that for a brief period of time they have in some reasonable way manifested, and the character has never left mundane reality. A storyteller could certainly rule that it still requires Spirit 4 to take the whole group there, but it never loses the trappings of the real world. We are pulling the supernal into the mundane as opposed to the other way around. I don't know if that's actually how the tradition would work, but that's kind of my first thought. I also like the idea of a chaos magic practitioner having to deal with the fact that every time they do a very high level effect that generates an egregore, it sticks around. You may not necessarily have paradox, but when you did that high level of effect, which required the creation of an egregore, it doesn't just go away when you're done. It's now an entity that has its own metaphysical connection to you in the cosmos. So, like, one of the limitations on you using extreme magic is the fact that it's like, okay, you have another being that's going to come into existence, and they may not get along with you forever. Or, like, suddenly you have to provide them with lunch money because they're stuck in reality and don't have a way of going back to the realm of thought forms. I don't know if any of that is reasonable, but that's kind of my first thought when I go there. Is there a notion of quintessence or some other magic juice that is shared among at least a fair number of chaos magic practitioners?
In terms of quintessence, I would almost say it's based on precisely like the tools that you're using or the belief system that you're articulating with. So,
Okay.
right, if you're using, say, more of a euthanatos-based practice, right, you're going to be bringing a lot of aspects of that violent entropy or, that kind of holistic understanding of this, this turning of, the cosmic wheel. You're going to be looking for quintessence that reinforces that. And it's interesting because I would almost say that a chaos magic practitioner has almost like specified quintessence in that there's not necessarily a game mechanic for this, but say, if you need to use some quintessence for this specific thing, and that almost like, is something that you've, say you have like all this background in, verbena practices, right? But you want to use something hermetic, you're going to have to almost like seek out this hermetic form of quintessence and say, well, this is what I need for that if I'm going to use it in that way. It almost becomes this, I would say, especially in regards to TAS, I would say TAS is like very much involved in this expression of chaos magic where you're not going to be always going out into a wellspring or a node and, just drawing this stuff ambiently. I would say the chaos magic practitioner is often just trying to create as much of this physically as they can so that they can then, utilize it, right? Have another tool in their tool set and say, well, I don't have the specific quintessence lying around, but I do have this hermetic wand that was gifted to me that, was very important to this person. And it's full of just jam-packed full of the stuff, right? And so you're always just collecting various things and being very eclectic about it.
So it sounds like they would have a very strong notion of task. They would have a relatively strong notion of resonance, certainly, but quintessence may be something that would be a little bit harder to represent in game. Maybe that is that leftover force that Spear talked about regarding
Kia, yeah.
Yeah. So that could be kind of a thing that a character could access to, but they weren't quite sure what was happening when they did. And I think that's a super, super neat idea. I think we've laid out a lot of the practice elements of it so far. Can you give me one or two ways that you feel a chaos magic practitioner would generate your standard Forces 3 Prime 2 Kaboom effect?
So just for kind of a pretty eclectic example, I would say you need like the basic components of what you're trying to generate as a whole. So say you have to activate this.
Hmm.
You need the materials and you need a way to activate it in a basic sense. So what I would say is Chaos Magic Petition would take advantage of kind of basic already existing materials and have this almost mystical aspect to them. So you would take something that you could, get very casually, or say it's like, okay, well, it's fire, right? Fireball. I need something red. A red balloon, right? Balloon contains air, which is essentially a fire. I can pour another element of fire, gasoline, into the balloon, slap a fire sigil on it, put a string to kind of light it up, let it fly towards whatever I'm kind of attempting to set on fire, light up the string, let it, float over towards it in a very coincidental way. What you've created is essentially something that does do exactly what you're supposed to, want it to do, but it does it in a very magnified way because you've taken the time to say, like, set this intention of a fire sigil and write it exactly on the balloon in like, this really delicate marker and penmanship. And so you're almost like weaponizing that basic property, right? And that's almost like a way that's a very basic example, but like almost like a techno magical rote could function is like you're taking something, right? A car that'll go very fast. It'll go a lot faster if you painstakingly go and like, put again these red hot flames on the end of it, very much kind of add these speed lines. And you're almost taking that resonance that the car already has and you're magnifying it via its own principles.
How would you read someone's mind? I guess we partially may have talked about this already in the form of like summoning that tulpa, or summoning that cognitive entity. But is there another way you would see that happening?
Yeah, I would say, again, take something associated with kind of that mental aspect. And I'm going to use kind of stuff that's like abstracted from any internal mage paradigm to something that like, say, like a hollow one would use, because I think that really grounds in a kind of a basic sense. Say, like, take a copy of the DSM-5, right? And you want to, read someone's mind, right? So you're taking this already existing diagnostic tool, get yourself some kind of camera, right? Take a picture of that person, glue that picture to the front of the copy of the DSM-5, kind of meditate on it a bit, let yourself soak it in this ritual space around this copy of it just to make sure that it's consecrated, and then randomly flip open a page in it. And I think within the context of mage, that's a really serviceable way to say this person might exhibit this kind of behavior. And then, with a success, your GM can like really state in this almost like randomized medical way of, I would never know this about a person, right? And you just read their mind, but you never had to even come anywhere close to them. You just associated them with something that's already a diagnostic tool. And that can have its own flaws in terms of like, if you don't want an extreme medical analysis, right? If you don't want that, then you could take something like that's more mystical or, more bent in a certain way. But that's definitely a way you could go about it.
How would you do correspondence effects, moving quickly from one place to another?
Because chaos magic is so physicalist, you often just have to like basically try and really blunt force a certain notion into existence if you want it to happen with just straight up teleporting, right? Pretty much as instantaneous as you can get. I'd say, if someone's a fan of, like, say you have a hollow one who's a fan of 90s action movies, if they want to, go from Paris to Hong Kong, I would argue almost they would need to kind of already be or have been within like, those two spaces, right? Just to have it make sense. Find, say, like a hotel in Paris and Hong Kong, right? Two different hotels. Take the same poster of the 1994 movie Speed, slap it on those two different doors, right, within those hotels, and they can be like janitor doors or whatever, but it's the same poster. And essentially, mark it in a certain way where it becomes an expression of that travel. And after you're done doing that, say you can link this between two different chantries even, right? And then have that instantaneous teleportation where it's like, okay, say a certain code phrase or whatever, you want to be really secure about it, and I open the door and that enters into the exact same place in the Hong Kong chantry and vice versa. Now the thing with this is that because chaos magic is so, I would say, open as a practice, this doesn't necessarily lend itself to a great amount of, again, security. If people aren't in the know. So sleepers could very much take it as like, oh, speed, okay, like I need to use the janitor closet or whatever. So it's great for improv. you might not necessarily want to have that down, all the time, right? You might want to have someone who's like, can you put up the poster again so I can teleport?
Is it reasonable to say that discerning someone's sigil could be an analog to true names for a chaos magician?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yes. I mean, because sigils are so personal because unlike with general hermetic Crowleyan style, it's not like these things have been reproduced in an exact way, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they don't have like a superlative, like, identical formula all the time, right? Everyone has a different method. So you're not going to be able to easily identify it if you don't, know a whole lot about the person, right? So if you examine someone's writings, right, like even like their chicken scratch on like, again, like the back of a napkin or something, or post that they wrote, if you take that examination and try to like figure out how this works, suddenly that security sigil on that door, it's not going to be so secure. And it's very much like, because you're reliant on these very broad practices, you can get into a bit of hot water with in regards to that. But that comes to the territory, right? It's an ease of use, but also not the greatest way to keep yourself safe.
That makes sense. Do you have any recommendations on how to do direct material manifestations, like creating food out of nowhere or something like that?
I would say generally visualization helps a lot with that from this perspective. So you, like an average supermarket, pick up like one of those coupon magazines that they have,
Mm-hmm.
go home, open up like your cabinet and like get some, like look online and see like, okay, what's like a seasoning that would go good with, say, like this steak in this magazine, right?
Mm-hmm.
Cut out the picture of a steak, get your seasoning, right? And get a plate, put that picture on there, pour the seasoning on top of it, and use the price of what that discounted steak is, right? Say it's like, $7.99. In the microwave, you just put it for 7 minutes and 99 seconds, and you let that thing go. Walk away, just go read a book or whatever, pet your cat, and by the time you come back, okay, there's a steak. Might not taste any good, but I bet you it'd be nutritious.
Yep. It meets the minimum requirements of steak. Trying to come up with the effects like that are this weird kind of exercise in seemingly lateral thinking, in figuring out what the connections are between everyday objects and trying to pull them into reality. Like, as you mentioned, it kind of has this Platonist bend to it, but instead of, again, us trying to shove ourselves into the realm of forms, it is being better able to take representations of those forms and manipulate them in it kind of in meat space. Do you have any thoughts about backgrounds for a chaos magician? Like, for instance, what is there a talisman or a familiar or a node or something that comes to mind in being like, hey, this is what that would look like for a chaos magic user?
I mean, I would say with, familiars and allies and stuff, egregores could easily, become that kind of thing. I would say, like, for a lot of it though, chaos magic is very grounded in almost this like social perception of magic.
Mm-hmm.
And going with that, I think a lot of chaos magic practitioners, you're going to have a lot of contacts and definitely probably some allies and maybe even a bit of fame. If you're like pretty much like a notorious like person who goes around and does weird stuff like this, because it's not like you're like a cloistered, like, oh, I must draw the circle in a hidden, far off chantry that no one knows about. You're doing this stuff pretty much on an everyday level, right? And you don't often have the time to do like all this prep work. So you're going to need help with it, with, contacts and retainers. Yeah, you would often probably have some of that. I don't think it would be exactly like this kind of almost authoritative way that some other traditions or, union members would have it. But I think it'd be very much like, listen, I got my crew. If I need to do a bigger working, like, listen, you're over there, I'm over here. Just follow this basic prep, and I'll like look it over and give it the, the enlightened, once over, and we'll just kind of get that done. And I think contacts and allies can definitely help with manifesting, knowledge, books, archives, definitely foci. If you're a chaos magic practitioner who's just trying to get your fingers in all kinds of pies, you're going to want a lot of foci. And in that way, it's like, listen, if you need the specific brand of gun that this one character used in order to kind of embody that character's aspect, you probably need to order that off of some, obscure backstock from this one guy. And having context definitely helps out with that.
that kind of nicely explains things. So we've talked about a lot of things within the chaos magic world. Are there any other things that you, before someone goes out and says, hey, I want to bring this into my game, either any neat bits that we didn't have a chance to discuss, or any resources that you would recommend, or any interesting manifestations you've seen of chaos magic within Mage that you want to share?
In regards to that last point, I very much wanted to make this clear. As someone who's practiced this stuff for 3 years and, who's gotten into Mage beforehand and, didn't really know about this when I got into Mage, but I've kind of discovered this about Mage as I've played it and ran it. Mage is a game that more or less teaches you the basic principles of chaos magic. Don't know if, Stuart and Steve Wick intended that once upon a time. It's not inconceivable that they could. I mean, it did exist, in the early 90s as a kind of a general idea within certain occult spaces. But outside of stuff like the Zen in the art of motorcycle maintenance, like chaos magic is the DNA of Mage. Like if you read the first edition, it teaches you like, okay, see all this stuff as practices, right? Here's the foci. Like it gives you this very atomized, broken down understanding of what each of these things does and how to do them and how to combine them together. And M20 is like almost like the full manifestation of that. And it's very illustrative. If you play Mage and if you run it, if you've read the book, you kind of already know what chaos magic is, even if you don't even know it. And I would say that it provides a very accessible, if not always like intrinsically easy to understand way, because you're just taking the ideas of the game, paradigm, practice, instrument, these things. You're taking that and you're just applying it via this explicit kind of meta paradigm way. I would say that in regards to like if you want additional material, right? If the book kind of like you're kind of reading the book about chaos magic and you're just saying like, well, M20 is kind of leaving me lost here. I don't quite understand it yet. I would definitely say just seek out books like Liber Null and Psychonaut. I would say it's a little bit arcane because it's from the 70s, but as an alternative, Condensed Chaos by Phil Hines is a book that very much approaches the subject from this kind of like fun, very lackadaisical, like, easygoing manner, and can kind of really get your foot in the ground door and say, okay, well, here's what it is. I can get it now, and I don't have to have a headache over it. I would also say if you want a like piece of media that's also illustrative of it, that's not Mage, Grant Morrison's The Invisibles is like the chaos magic manifesto. It is exactly this and everything besides, and it's definitely this huge sprawling work, and it's a lot to kind of grapple around, but once you kind of see what's going on, it becomes very easy to see like, oh, this is what is going on with this. And I would definitely say it's just a very interesting Mage adjacent piece of media. I would almost like next to the Matrix, The Invisibles is like Mage, the adaptation, right? Even though I don't know if Grant Morrison, I don't know if they ever really were, aware of Mage as a thing. Probably not, but like it does come across in a lot of ways as almost like a sister volume to the kind of second edition of Mage as an expression of, what magic is in this kind of era.
Yeah, it's one of those things where a lot of people have listed The Invisibles as the inspiration for Mage, but like Mage came out a year or so before The Invisibles published. I would like to at some point get to do an episode on the notional inspirations for Mage and see where that takes us. But yeah, and sometimes it just captures the zeitgeist that a bunch of people are thinking about the same thing at the same time. Yui, it's been great to talk to you. This has been a wonderful conversation explaining something that constantly comes up in the background of Mage conversations. If people are interested in knowing what you are up to, is there a social media presence at all that you share? The answer may be no.
No, absolutely. I have a Twitter account at comrade_Yui. And I also have a Letterboxd account under the same name. Mainly, I just talk about movies and various like interests, and generally like occultism and paganism and stuff like that. Right now, I'm just focusing on wrapping up my second Mage game and tentatively looking forward to constructing a third, which is getting more and more ridiculously complicated as things go on. And I kind of have the inverse problem of you running all these one shots where I've run nothing but these big immense chronicles where a bunch of important things happen, like a laser beam being shot at planet Earth. And at a certain point, the World of Darkness just doesn't become the World of Darkness anymore, and it becomes your game. And you kind of have to reckon with that. At a certain point, right, if you're running Vampire, Gehenna probably happens. And what comes after Gehenna? And with Mage, it's everyone constantly undergoing a various amount of apocalypses and revelations, and it quickly destabilized into well, the Void Engineers aren't with the Techs anymore. I guess that's a thing, and that's just no longer the setting you started out with. So it's interesting, and my players are having a great time.
Yeah, it generally goes to the apocalyptic end, or the characters getting super obsessed with the fact that one of their familiars is a sentient bee who would like to learn how to read, and it just becomes like these remarkably twee pastoral mage stories. And it is both damning and celebratory of the setting that the game can seemingly incorporate both. I'm still waiting for someone to come up with the Chronicle book, which is more or less just Alan Moore's novel Jerusalem or something like that, and then I'll be like, okay, we're done. We finised. And then we can
it totally could be that.
Yeah.
I mean, Mage is a game of, I mean, it's not a game of either or. It's a game of yes and
Yeah.
and so on.
Yui, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Terry.
This has been Mage the Podcast, where if I could create a servitor, it would probably be doing audio editing for me. This show is made possible by our executive producers, who are Alexander Gorton, Anders S., Andrew Edelstein, Andy, Berto, Boogers, Brendan Morrill, Bryce Perry, Chris Sack, Dan Svensson, Dennis Osborne, Entropy Prime, Freddie, Gabrielle Elizaro, Garga Lenoir, Guy Conan Stewart, Ian, Isabel Castillo, Jason Kennedy, Jason W. Biggs, Jay Sunstern, Jen F., John Horton, John Magnuson, Josh Goulden, Josh H., Josh Heath, Carl Halperin, Leslie Weatherstone, Michael Creedle, Michael Parker, Nibero, Neil Patterson, Nikita Klaimanov, Ralph Scheinhammer, Richard Bat Brewster, Ryan Hilton, Ryan Kendi, Samuel Tobin, Stephen Carton, William Connolly, William Martin, and W. Starter. Special thanks to Oracle members, Christopher Phillips, the Oracle of trade paperbacks that you lost a while ago, but you were able to find a real cheap version online from someone who had mislabeled it. And also to Buck Farmer, the Oracle of reminding me that I accidentally called our Oracles Archmasters in our last episode. My bad. Our EP shoutout is to Garga Lenoir, whose name reminds me of Gargamel from the Smurfs TV show. Gargamel's goal was to apparently destroy the Smurfs and turn them into gold, which is odd because based on all the other powers like creating a magnet that attracts things that are strictly blue, he could just probably make gold. Additionally, he created Smurfette, which seemingly as a Smurf suggests Gargamel could make the precursor material required for gold, namely a Smurf. Thanks for your support. If you like this episode or super don't, drop us a line at matesthepodcast@gmail.com or at matesthepodcast on Twitter. We have a hop and Discord community at discord.me/matesthepodcast. If you like us, please give us a review on the platform of your choosing or tell a friend about us. Also go to matesthepodcast.com for show notes and all of our previous shows. Now, go change reality. Bye.